I was 14 years old when I got my very first job outside of the house and the farm. 14 years old, and I finally got my first paid position. I say finally, but 14 feels really early to be working, but at least now it does because my kids are almost 13. But my first job was working at the Indiana State Fair. I worked on the trolleys that took you around the fair and everything like that. My whole job was to sit in the Mector-pulled bench trolley. And as people would come and sit down, I would tell them it was 25 cents per person in their party. It was boring. But hey, it was my first steps towards making money on my own. After the fair wrapped up that year, in fact, I got my first regular job. I worked for a really small business who their whole business model was to build programs for small business companies. And my job was to do cold calling. Because everybody loves getting cold called, right? 14-year-old Brandon heard some very colorful words. But that was my job at that point in time. That was followed up by my first foray into the world of retail. I worked for a Meijer as a cart collector. That was a very brief stint as a cart collector because about 2 weeks in, I sprained my ankle severely to the point I couldn't bear weight on, and you can't walk. That's a problem. And since I was still in my probationary period, my higher-ups at Meijer told me to put an egg in my shoe and beat it. But it wound up being a pretty good thing that happened because this would lead to what would ultimately become my favorite job. Of all the jobs that I have held outside of ministry, it is by far my favorite job, to the point that if I could have made a living doing this, I'd still be there. I love that job so much, and that was working for Gabe's Pizza in Kokomo, Indiana. Oh, my goodness, I loved that job. When I got hired on, it was not your traditional hiring methods, right? Like I didn't come in and fill out an application. I walked in one day and asked to see the manager. I didn't realize that at the time there were no managers at Gabe's. There was just Tony. You talked to Tony, the owner, Tony Gabriel. He asked me what on the little pads that they take pizza orders on and stuff, and he asked me what sort of things that I do at school, and I told him that I am the world's biggest band nerd, both metaphorically and literally. And then he asked me, what's my phone number? That was it. And then he said, well, I'll call you and I'll let you know. And when he hadn't called me in a week, I reached out to Tony myself, and he said, appreciate you calling me back, Double B. Why don't you come in on Thursday at 5? That was it. And thus started the best job in human history. I mean, I literally got to make joy on a crust every day. Tony had this super secret sausage recipe, and it was a thing that made Gabe stand out from every other pizza place, was the sausage that would go on it. Now you would think that given all that, or given the limitations that we had, we wouldn't see a whole lot of business. I mean, small and large, that was it. We only had like 3 sandwiches, I think, altogether on top of that. Those were your options. We had 5 toppings: pepperoni, the super secret sausage, mushrooms, green peppers, and onions. Tony did not like technology, so he did not take credit cards. You could only pay with cash or check. And you would assume that all of that would mean that not very many people went to Gabe's Pizza, but everybody in Kokomo knows Gabe's Pizza. Mandy, next time we're home, we have a stop to make. So I loved working at this particular job because, I got to make all this stuff every night. Tony himself was just a great boss. Your whole first few weeks of working at Gabe's was simply to get fast enough that Tony could trust you to work on Fridays and Saturdays, because those were easily the busiest nights ever. But when it was during the week, things were obviously slower. Wednesday at 7 o'clock at night. So most of the time you were getting paid to stand around and watch TV and chit-chat with your coworkers. If we were really slow, Tony would even go so far as to let us do our homework so long as we did it in the back, especially when the health inspector came around. But he was just a fantastic boss. He wasn't just a great boss, though. He was also a great dude. Tony would check in on you regularly, not just to make sure that you were check to make sure that everything was going okay at school, that everything was all right at home. He cared about his employees. Tony never had children of his own, but if you worked for Tony, you were one of Tony's kids. It was the best job. But shortly after I started working there, within about the first few months, Tony developed a cough. It was kind of unusual. A very athletic guy. He played racquetball like a mad fiend. When he wasn't doing that, he was also an assistant basketball coach at my high school, and he loved showing those kids that the old guy can still go. In fact, he is in the Howard County Hall of Fame for athletics, which I didn't know was a thing until Tony got announced for it, so that was cool. But this cough persisted, and it became aggressive enough that Tony eventually went to go do a series of tests, and by the end of it, we found out that Tony had developed throat cancer. That meant that for the next extended period of time in his life, it was going to be filled with doctor appointments and treatment plans. And that also meant that Tony wasn't going to be able to have the time nor the strength to do all the things that he had done at Gabe's Pizza. And Tony, as the owner, Tony did everything. Absolutely everything. But that meant that he would have to start sharing some of those responsibilities with some of the more senior employees at Gabe's. So he asked KP if she could start handling ordering for all the food-related items, the green peppers, the sauce, the mushrooms, the cheese, everything else that we needed as far as food-related things. He asked Matt if he could be the one to contact repair guys whenever something broke, like if the freezer was no longer working. That's a problem when you work in food. If the sausage grinder is not working, that was a big problem because we needed our sausage. He asked a bunch of us to just start taking on added responsibilities than what we'd ever done before. He started showing a lot of his more seasoned employees how to count out the drawers at the end of the night, what his method was for checking the tickets and the cash on hand to make sure that everything lined up the way it was supposed to. Shocking of all to every single one of us. The first time that any of us recognized that there was a real serious problem on our hands was when Tony asked Mike to come and learn how to make the super secret sausage. For the first time since Tony's father had opened Gabe's Pizza, somebody with a last name other than Gabriel would be the one to make the sausage. At first, Tony really struggled with this. I mean, when you're the owner of a restaurant, it's your baby. And you're asking other people to handle these sort of things. And so he really struggled with letting go of some of that responsibility, the things that he had been doing for years. He had bought the business from his father 25 years before his diagnosis, and every day he poured into that business. Tony didn't do things like take vacations. He loved making pizza. That was his whole life. I asked him once, why don't we take credit cards? And he says, I'm not in this to make money. I just love making pizza. And so to hand off that responsibility at first, it became very difficult for him. But as he noticed that KP and Matt and Mike were really starting to get the hang of all this stuff, he began to ease off. He began to relax more because he understood that these guys can handle this. And so when the cancer came back a second time, and when it came back a third, Tony knew, my people got this. And now, 18 years. Time is stupid. 18 years after the cancer finally won, Gabe's Pizza is still going strong. Tony's brother Guido is now the owner, but he's really just the owner in name only. Matt is still there. He's been working there this year. He had like one other job, but he did that while still working at Gabe's. But he's the one who's kind of handling everything. He is running all 3 now locations of Gabe's Pizza. It's not just stayed, it has grown in the absence of Tony. All because Tony was willing to trust that people could handle things in his absence, that he was willing to hand things off. And I don't think still be around had Tony not been willing to share some of that responsibility. You've heard me say before, and you're likely going to hear me say again, that knowledge that is not shared with other people is knowledge that is ultimately wasted. If we don't pass along things that onto other people around us, then that knowledge that we have, by the time we reach the end, it's not really going to matter anymore. For probably as long as but we live in times right now, because as long as there have been people who have lived in multiple generations, and those multiple generations have lived with each other, older people have complained about the younger generation, and younger people have complained about the older generation. But ever since the rise of the internet and the advent of social media, it seems like that has just gotten louder. Baby boomers complain about millennials about Gen Z, and everybody just ignores Gen X because, well, they're fine. And that seems to be the way that it's going to be until the world stops spinning. But one of the common criticisms that I have heard over and over again in my life, especially as it relates to the older generation complaining about the younger generation, the thing that I have seen most prevalent in our world today is that, well, they don't know how to do blank. I heard a lady online complaining that she's worried that this next generation that's coming up is going to be the first generation where nobody knows how to do things like bake a pie or write in cursive or handle all these sorts of things. And you've probably heard that criticism yourself. In fact, chances are some of you older folks in here, I've seen some of y'all's social media. You've been the ones complaining about that. And it's to that particular criticism that I want to ask a question in response to it. Whose responsibility was it to teach them that? Understand, I'm not asking that question with any sort of snarkiness, or I'm not trying to be sarcastic. It probably is coming across that way because, well, it's me. I'm being genuine, though, in that question. If we complain about the fact that younger generations don't know how to do certain things, then we have to pose the question, well, whose job was it to teach them? Human beings have this weird thing about us that if nobody shows us how, then, right? And here's the thing, I think the real thing that comes alongside of it, the reason why it's become a problem is because oftentimes time just gets away from us, right? We seem to be busier now than we've ever been in the history of humanity. It seems like every day is filled with more and more stuff to get done. And the issue is that even when you have knowledge that you feel is worthy of being passed on, that you feel it's worthy of being shared, the schedule just does not allow it. And so you are so compact with all this other stuff going on around you. You keep thinking, I'm going to have time eventually. I'm going to do this at some point in time. But then by the time you finally have time, the kids are out of the house. They're off doing their own thing. Life has simply passed you by. And all of a sudden there's no longer time to share that information, to pass along those family recipes, to share those experiences that you've had in your life. And we're just left not able to pass along these things to the next generation. The thing is, we even do this in the church. This is a problem even within the church. So often there are people who have been in their roles of service for years, maybe even decades, and they've never passed that information of how to handle those things to somebody else. A number of years ago in the church that I was serving at the time, we had this older lady who was she was the fellowship hall meal, right? Like if we had a fellowship hall meal coming along, if we had any sort of like church picnic, something like that, she was the one that you talked to make sure that it would all get set up, because she had a flawless system of how to get things set up quickly, how to make sure that it went together. She had a mental checklist of everything that had to get done, even to the point that she knew how to clean everything and where to put it up when it was all said and done. If she had help with her, it was somebody who was just there to move tables and chairs. That was it. But primarily, she did it all on her own. And one day I was in the church and I overheard her saying to somebody, I don't know how much longer I can do this, but I don't have anybody to give this to. Nobody is going to know how to run the fellowship hall. And it's easy for our knee-jerk reaction there to be somewhat sympathetic, is it not? The thing of it is, I knew of at least 3 women in our church who had tried to go into the fellowship hall to help her, who wanted to learn from her, who wanted to know what her system was, only to be told by her, "That's okay, sweetie, I've got this." But understand the need, and I do mean need, in sharing our knowledge and passing down what we can do as acts of service has always been prevalent in the church. We need to pass along our knowledge of how to handle things on to the next generation. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why it would bring together our final dynamic duo of this particular series. In the pantheon of Old Testament prophets, and there are a lot of prophets in the Old Testament, and all of them did cool stuff. All of them got to see God move in some big ways, but in my opinion, Elijah stands out in a class all by himself. If all Elijah had done in his entire ministry was call out the evil King Ahab and Jezebel and tell them that they are wrong and that God was going to enact justice on him, that would be punk rock enough to earn all of our admiration, would it not? But then to tell those same evil people that God was going to enact a drought, and then there is a drought, to go and to help a widow and her son not only survive through the resulting famine, but to even thrive in the midst of it. To then raise the young boy after he had fallen ill. And then to have a mountaintop showdown with all the prophets of Baal, calling down fire from heaven from God that would burn up everything, including, how do we not talk about this more? The rocks themselves got burned to ash. And then on top of that, after all that is done, wiping out all those false prophets. How has that not been turned into a movie? It's got to be Keanu Reeves, right? I got this great idea for John Wick 5, everybody. Elijah did so much cool stuff all throughout his ministry. God was working through this man in a way that is so unseen, to the point that it would reverberate throughout the remainder of Scripture, that when Jesus was standing on a mountaintop himself, transformed in front of his disciples with 2 of the Bible's most influential people, Moses and Elijah. That's impressive company to be a part of, is it not? Gosh, I love Elijah. He's so cool. But just a few weeks removed from that mountaintop experience, from being there as the fire comes down from heaven, everything changes a little bit for him, because he would join up with dynamic duo. We're going to find ourselves in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 19 through 21. This is going to be where we're going to start off. We are going to skip ahead a little bit, but I'll give you plenty of heads up, or at least I'll try to. I might get carried away. I do that from time to time. But God, after the mountaintop experience, God had finally allowed it to rain for the first time in 3 years. And there's something that we always forget about when it comes to things like this, and that's oftentimes, well, plants can't grow right when there's no water. I don't know what your experience was in high school science class, but plants need water. Right? You can't use Gatorade, even though Gatorade's got electrolyte. It's got what plants crave. If you understood that reference, we can be best friends. Plants need water in order to survive, and so if you're a farmer, and I want to remind you that this is an agriculturally based economy, meaning that 90% or more of the population farmed in some capacity, that means that for 3 years you've been unable to grow crops that do cool things like feed your family and put money in your pocket. It's a pretty sizable problem to have. And so after 3 years of no rain, once it finally rains, you got to imagine that all these farmers have been eagerly waiting for this moment. And so they do the only thing that makes any sense to them. They go and they start working the land. And that's exactly where we find Elisha, the other side of our dynamic duo, which I don't know why God chose to pair them up, Elijah and Elisha, but it means that I have to really work on my enunciation. So we're going to get through this. It's going to be fine, right? It's so much easier when it's Peter and John because those are completely different. But as we pick up the story in verse 19, we are introduced to Elisha for the first time. It says, so he being Elijah, departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. Elisha is doing his thing, right? He's plowing the field probably for the first time in about 3 years. Right? This is the first time that they're going to be able to plant a crop and know that there at least has a chance of producing for them. And we're given the impression that this must be a fairly large field, right? Because it's talking about 12 pair of oxen, 12 yoke oxen, which means 2 pairs per yoke, which means 24 oxen. That's a lot of cow. But Elisha himself is pulling the last one, and 90% of the time, if you worked the field, it's because your family owned it. And so we can gather 2 things from this particular thing. 1, this is a large field. 2, Elisha's family's got money because they're able to own a field this large. But don't miss when Elijah places his cloak on Elisha. This is a significant moment. Right? Elisha knows this is, right? We're again, just a few weeks removed from the mountaintop experience. And if you've ever read that story or you know about it, people are probably still talking about it, right? How do you not talk about something that cool? And so when Elijah comes and he places his cloak on Elisha, he's got to get goosebumps almost instantaneously, right? Because somebody this incredible has just invited him to come and be his protege, right? I don't know who the coolest person is that you can think of. I mean, to me, it's got to be The Rock, right? But if The Rock were to suddenly come up to me and say, hey, I want you to come be my protege, well, he's a billionaire, so bye, guys. How do you not do that? So Elijah has just placed his cloak around him, and that also symbolizes that Elisha is now forever going to be associated with him, that he's going to carry the crest of Elijah as part of him. Right? This is similar to the same thing as when Jesus went to the disciples individually and said simply, follow me. This is a huge honor because the prophet of God has just invited you along to join with him. And as excited as Elisha has to be in this moment, he does make a request. He does ask Elijah for something in verse 20. And we read in there, it says that he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And he said to him, go back, for what have I done for you? This whole thing was actually ordained by God before any of all of this. If you skip back to verse 16, it actually says in the second half of it, God is telling Elijah what's going to happen. He tells him, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. This whole thing has been a part of it. And so when Elisha asked for permission to go and just simply say goodbye to his family, he is able to do so with Elijah's blessing. But when Elisha chooses to say goodbye, dude knows how to make an exit. Verse 21 shows us exactly what he did. It says, and he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. He took the 2 oxen that he had been working with, the ones that had been his responsibility to care and to maintain, the ones that he had been following behind as they plowed the field, and he sacrificed them as an offering to God, as a way of worshiping God for the amazing blessing of his life. And now this blessing is about to take a whole new fold as he goes on. But then he boils it. That's 2 oxen. That's a lot of beef. And he shares that with the people around him. Now, personally, I would have probably smoked them slow and low until they were fall off the bone tender. Elisha chose to boil them, but it's just a difference in preference, I suppose. But we might look at this particular act and we might say, why would he do this, right? Oxen and animals, no matter what era you live in, they are not cheap. And yet he has just essentially wasted a bunch of his father's money to go and do this sort of thing. So we might ask, why would he choose this as his method of saying goodbye? And the reason is really quite simple. By destroying the instruments of his labor up to this point, he is telling his family, I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back to this life. This fallback plan. Because he is going to chase after Elijah. He is going to follow him as closely as he possibly can. And he is going to commit everything to following the prophet of God and to learn from him. And man, Elisha got to see Elijah do some pretty cool stuff. He got to see the legend in action, because not long after this, the evil king and queen, Ahab, and dastardly of all villains in Scripture, they use coercion and influence to get an innocent man stoned to death for a crime he did not commit, all because they want his vineyard. Oh, that's just such a bad guy move, isn't it? The new Superman movie comes out this week. I'm not even remotely excited about that, but it's something you can see Lex Luthor doing, right? And so when they do that sort of thing, Elijah himself, he comes right to him. And even though the text doesn't say this specifically, every biblical scholar that I consulted in my preparation for this said, as his protege, as his disciple, Elisha would have been there right beside him, as Elijah tells King Ahab and Jezebel exactly what God has to say to them in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 19. God says, and you shall say this to them, thus says the Lord, have you killed and also taken possession? And you shall, says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick your own blood. This is the king and queen of the country. They could walk away from this meeting and say, well, you're done. And then a soldier comes in and kills Elijah, right? But he is telling him not just, hey, God's going to get even. He is telling him dogs are going to lick up your blood. How cool is this guy? I love him so much. Because he has just confronted the king and queen and told them, God says y'all are about done. And he does so in like the most heavy metal way possible. Oh my goodness, it's so good. But not only that, Elisha would be there as Elijah would also denounce the next king of Israel after Ahab and Jezebel are killed. I hit the stand too much. Now I can't see. All right. I never thought I was a pulpit smashing preacher before, but here we are. Elijah would go ahead and denounce the next king of Israel because he was just as wicked. He was just as evil. He was just as stupid. He was just as bad as what they had been. And it's kind of on brand for Elijah, right? Like, we like to complain about some of our elected officials, don't we? I don't see anybody walking up to President Trump saying dogs are going to lick your blood. I don't know, maybe they have. Who knows? People have said a lot of things to that dude. But Elisha gets to witness all of this cool stuff that's going on, and he gets to learn so much from Elijah simply by walking with him. Because don't forget, the invitation that Elijah gave him was not to hear lecture after lecture. It was simply to come alongside. It was simply an invitation to come and watch and learn by. After what many scholars believe was a period of about 6 years of following after Elijah, Elijah himself begins to recognize that his time is drawing near. That he is nearly completed with his journey on this earth. And Elijah tells his protege that God has told him that he is going to go to Bethel and that Elisha should just stay behind and wait. But Elisha says, I can't do that. I'm going to follow you no matter what. And so as Elijah makes his way up to the place where God is going to take him away, Elisha is right behind him the whole time. Along the way, they get all these sort of like ominous messages from all these other little prophets hanging around there going like, hey, Elisha, do you know that today is the day that God is going to take away your leader? And I love Elisha for this. He says, yes, I know. Shut up. And they continue to make their way up onto this mountaintop. And once they're nearing the place where God is about to take Elijah away in the most significant and memorable, and because it's Elijah and he's so cool anyway, the coolest way he could possibly do so. Before that happens, Elijah turns to his protege and he tells him something significant. He gives him an opportunity that he probably wasn't expecting in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9. It says, when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you. Ask what it is that you want me to do for you before I'm gone. And Elisha said, please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me. This is such a crucial and yet low-key moment in the relationship of this particular dynamic duo. It's one that I think we overlook, but if we understand what's really going on here, this is a huge moment between these two men who have worked alongside of each other for 6 years now, being with each other every day, probably every moment of every day. Elijah has asked his protege, what would you like from me before I go? And Elisha asked for a double portion. Now, we struggle a little bit here because in our culture, our context, we may read this as Elisha is basically telling Elijah, I want to be twice the prophet that you were. I want to have twice the power, twice the authority, twice the prophetess, I don't know, that you have. But that's not what he's doing here. When he asks for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, what he is asking for is the right of the firstborn. Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 17 says, but he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the firstfruits of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Elisha, by asking for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, is asking for the right of the firstborn son. If you lived in that culture, that context, then oftentimes the firstborn, yes, he would than his brother and sister, but he would also receive more responsibility because now he would be sitting in the seat of his father. He would assume the role of his father. And so what Elisha is asking for from Elijah here is treat me like I'm your firstborn son. Let me take the reins from you. Let me become a prophet in your place. I'm ready. After 6 years, Elisha is asking to become the prophet in his stead, for God to use him in the same way that he has used his mentor and his friend. He has learned everything that he can, and he's ready to take it over. It's a difficult thing for us. Think about what will happen when we are either incapable or, let's say, not around to do the things that we have always done. No one likes to think about their own mortality. Nobody likes to be face to face with the realities of aging. And especially as we have served in the church, served in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, it becomes even more difficult sometimes for us to imagine anybody else doing what we are doing. But the reality is that one day, for one reason or another, someone else is going to have to. And that's true of me. I mean, I'm not the first pastor this church has ever had. Lord willing, I don't think I'm going to be the last one. If I am, something really bad happened. So we need to be training the people who are behind us, the generation that follows after us, showing them the way of what it means to serve in the ways that God would have us serve. Some of you in this room have been serving this church and churches like it for years, decades even. In the case of Ray, centuries. I love you, buddy. I couldn't let it pass. But some of you have been serving in the same capacities and in the same ways for years. And understand there's no problem with that. You need to be commended for the service that you have done. The issue is not in finding joy and fulfillment in the ways that you are serving the Lord. The problem becomes when you become so prideful that you start thinking nobody else can do this but me. I wrestled with the word prideful. But that's what it is. It's pride and it's arrogance that tells us nobody can do this the way that I can do this. Way of passing along our knowledge, of sharing what it means to serve in the ways that God would have us do so. Instead, we should be seeking to find ways to train the generation behind us, teaching them what it means to serve the church that we love so dearly. I firmly believe that most of you who have been serving in those same capacities forever aren't doing it because you just kind of like the church. You're doing it because you love it. You want to see it reach its full potential, and that is a beautiful thought. But the generation behind you feels the same way. And they want to be just as much a part of it. And so as the older generation, we need to be looking for those people that we can train, that we can build up, that we can encourage to become the replacement for us. And yes, I know that's a hard word for us, but understand, so far Father Time is undefeated. One day there will be a day where for one reason or another you may not be able to fulfill the role that you always have. And what happens to that ministry that you've poured into for that long? If nobody knows how to handle the job that you've done, what's going to happen? It's a tough thing for us to think about. And again, understand, I am incredibly grateful for the work that you have done in this church. I know I've only been here for a year and like 2 weeks, but I'm still grateful for all the work that every person in this room has done in the name of Jesus for this church. But we also need to be ready for what happens next. We need to be preparing to reach that next generation, to pour into the young people in this church. We have young kids in this room right now who love this church and who want to serve in it, but they don't have anybody showing them how. Titus chapter 2, verses 6 through 8 says, "Likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works. And in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say." We need to be willing to teach the generation that is behind us, to show them what it means to serve after God. But of course, that means that there is another side of this particular coin, is there not? For those of you who are younger in this room right now, who want to serve the church, who are eager to do the things that you feel like God is calling you. And I remember what it was like to be at that age and just feeling like my heart's going to explode because I know that God wants to know what that something is, and I want to find it out, and I want to get to work right now. I get that. But understand, you got to learn to walk before you can run. You got to learn how to serve before you can take that over. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5 says, "Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." And so we reach the point where we have to ask the question, how? Right? Like, we understand the importance of mentorship now, or at least I really hope you do. But we ask the question, how? Because we've already said that the schedule gets so packed full of different things. I don't know where I'm going to find the time to be able to pull somebody aside and teach him how to do this. So how do I mentor the generation behind me? And to that I say, follow the example of Elijah. Right? Elijah didn't change his schedule. He didn't stop doing things so he could teach Elisha what it meant to do them. Instead, he had Elisha come alongside to learn from his example. He showed him by doing the things that he was always doing, and just had Elisha sit back and watch so that he could learn how to do those things for himself. So when an opportunity for service comes up and it's in your usual realm of service, instead of saying, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find the time to train somebody, just pick somebody and say, hey, come with me. Mentorship is oftentimes far simpler than we want to make it out to be, because it is simply inviting someone along. If they ask you questions, answer them. Questions are always going to be a natural part of it, right? But it doesn't mean you change your schedule. It just means that you bring along somebody with you. And I don't know about you, but my car can fit more than just me in it. Most of the rooms that I'm in can fit more than just me in them. Have these people watch what you're doing to the dynamics of your schedule, but it helps them learn and grow and develop a heart for service because they are learning how to do what you do. And ultimately, that is at the heart of not just our service, it is at the heart of our faith itself. Because as Paul would write in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, and we will close with it, be imitators of me as I am of Christ.